My name is Bill Geis, and I am assistant to the president of the Missouri District. And before coming to the district office in 2017, I was a pastor in 3 different locations over the past 30 plus years. And each of those invokes some type of shared ministry. So today's presentation is called Activating the Mission with Shared Ministry, but it's not necessarily maybe the traditional understanding of shared ministry, which often invokes the idea of a dual parish arrangement. Just one note about my experience. For about 15 years of my life, I worked as the pastor of 4 congregations by choice. I was called to a sole parish that was doing very well, and we started to look at regional opportunities and ministries and reach out to other congregations and said, what would it look like to share staff and support 5 counties over 4,500 square miles? This is in southwest Oklahoma. And that was that conversation started in 1994, and over the next decade plus, we were able to really touch about 1,000 people a week through various ministries. That one of the congregations only had 8 members, for example. Today, that congregation is the largest congregation in the network, and I've been gone for 17 years, and they continue to replicate and develop new ways to share ministry among them. So that's a little bit of my background, my passion for this. Wherever I've gone, I've kind of invoked the understanding or thinking that every congregation, regardless of your size or place, should think about shared ministry, because that's what it means to be in the body of Christ. So the first thing I want to do is just give us a working definition, the Bill Geis working definition of what is shared ministry. And I really have 5 components, so I have fill in the blanks for you so that we're back in school. First of all, it's about congregations. Congregations, not pastors. A lot of times the shared ministry conversation begins with, well, there might be a financial crisis, and how can we share a pastor? That's fine, that may bring you to the table, but shared ministries at its core is congregation-based, not pastor-centric. The second thing about it is that it's a stewardship of our ministry. We're acting as stewards. We're thinking about how can we use our God-given intellect to be able to manage all the resources God's given us. Thirdly, it is exercising those gifts. I as a parish pastor, are just as guilty as many other parish pastors in taking time, talent kind of surveys and then not using the people of God in effective ways. And one of the great things about this conference is there is just such a lay movement of people here, and to be able to empower people to use their gifts in meaningful and purposeful ways is really important. It's important to talk about clear vision, but I'm going to go to the last point, and that is for making disciples. One of the things that I think at the core of every Christian church needs to be that we're making disciples. That's the Great Commission, right? But locally, in its context, that's where vision comes in to say, what is it about us? Why are we the church in this place to have a unique vision of what it means to make disciples in this place, and how God's going to use us and the gifts around us to make that happen? And oftentimes we have only a vague idea of saying, well, we want to make disciples. We want to have new members. We want to have younger people in our churches. But having a clear picture of what that actually looks like is something that really invokes a fair amount of prayer and conversation and long suffering to get there, to have that clear picture. And I just want to emphasize that for our churches as we think about shared ministry. So shared ministry is not a quick fix. I just hit the clicker the wrong direction. So the paper you have, it really is part of a workshop that I do with congregations that takes 3 to 4 hours. So we're not going to go through all the points in this, but there are places where you can stop and do a little work when you go home. And you have my contact information. You're glad glad to follow up with you. I have questions about that. But I want you to think about, how are we engaged in shared ministry today? Whether or not you have a formal relationship with another congregation, I believe that just being a synod says we're in some type of shared ministry, although it may be minimal. And when we think about shared ministry, I want you to think about 3 ways of shifting your thinking and perception. The first is that we want to shift the conversation from feeling alone to working collaboratively. We've heard already a lot about that, in that sense that you're not alone, that there's a lot of encouragement around here at best practices. I'm like a 9-year veteran of attending best practices events, and I find it encouraging because I see that I'm not alone. And shared ministry gives us the opportunity to think about how we can collectively never be alone, and that we have a mindset that we have other people and groups of people that are a part of our support system. So even though I served 4 congregations simultaneously for over 10 years in a place I lived at for 15 years, I was never alone, and the healthiest years of my life were really in that shared environment because I had so much support around me. The second shift I want you to think about is that most congregations end up coming to me because of fear of survival. And something has happened to say, we got to talk about something because this ain't working. But at this point, we're at that point where we're sliding down the hill, and we're just afraid of our own self-survival. The problem is that in Jesus' a theology of the cross, what Martin Luther called, right? We're called to give up and die to ourselves so that we might find a new life in Christ. So when we're in survival mode, we're usually in self-preservation, a very sinful kind of mode, whether we realize it or not. And so we need to shift from that survival, like how are we going to survive, to what's the mission opportunity. I'm so proud to say, and this is not me, this is the work of the Holy Spirit, when I came to my little town of Lone Wolf, Oklahoma in 1990, people there told me that they would close in about a year. That's great, excitement for a person graduating from seminary and wanting to take on the world, and, we're going to die in a year. I'm glad to know that 32 years later, they are still going and thriving and doing mission work because they developed a sense of mission, and they weren't trying to figure out how they would survive keeping their next pastor. So it can be done. This final shift I want to talk about is that finances often lead us to the table. But we want to shift from money constraints to the idea of faithful stewardship. When ministries start to share, we start to think about our finances in a way that are able to add capacity to us and eliminate some of the redundancies of that. Whether it might seem kind of inappropriate in a fairly clergy-centric denomination as the Lcms, we decided that we could do with one pastor and put other people around that pastor that had gifts, like social workers and child care ministry and a business operations manager and adult education. And so I had all these gifts around me that were faithfully stewarding the resources of people. And if they had put 4 pastors in the congregation, we'd have 4 generalists, and we wouldn't have had the kind of resources that I had for those 10 years when I was working in Oklahoma. So when you think about this last point, faithful steward, we're going to kind of double click on that a minute here and talk about it in 5 ways. Stewardship, before you ever get to money, is about people, right? Your people are your most valuable resource. They are most valuable to God. Money is just stuff, right? But then it's also your gifts of your property, and I would add now technology, because the pandemic has basically retrofitted every church technologically. And who could have done that? I don't care what synodical program you had or whatever, that we would have outfitted our churches in 2 to 6 weeks with technology. We couldn't have done that in a 20-year plan in the Missouri Synod if it weren't for COVID. So praise God for that. But our facilities, and typically when I go around to Lutheran churches, I'm amazed at actually how well kept and purposeful our facilities can be, but I'm also grieved at the fact that they're often used only 5 to 10% of their capacity. So we want to think about how we increase the capacity use of our facilities. It's also the gifts of service from institutions and other ministries in our neighborhood. So I was talking to this couple here from Sacramento, and they were sharing with me that they're partnering with Able Light, formerly Bethesda, and what a great opportunity. That's one of those institutions that does things with people with disabilities that bring a specialty to them as a partner. But it might be the local pregnancy care center, or it might be a type of ministry to some social need, or to immigrants and refugees in your community. So there are other institutional stewards that we have these resources that we may not own, but we have access to, and that matters. It's also the personal relationships. I know that there's a lot of frustration, especially with COVID and regulations and mandates and all these kinds of things. But don't get caught in that ugliness of it. The world works by who you know. Have you noticed that? Who you know and who you get to talk to, those things are the way things really work in the world. And God always puts us in front of people that we should know. They're not always in our churches, but they're people we know. And when I moved from Chicago to a town of less than 500 people in a county of less than 10,000 in one of the most poor parts of the United States, I was like a fish out of water. But I learned it was like who you knew. The superintendent of the school, the manager of the co-op. Those people were super powerful in the town, more than the city manager, because they ran all the business for the entire town. We didn't have business other than the school and the co-op. So who you know matters, and those are relationships that we ought to invest in and be listening to, and figure out how there are synergies for us to work together. And then finally, that gift of our finances. But when you think about finances, don't only include what comes in the offering plate. Think about the opportunities that you have to talk to people about investing in legacy gifts, and the opportunity to even endow your properties. So I'm going to stop there for a minute, and I'll have a few check-in points about every 15 minutes, and just say, do you have questions or whatever. But so this is one of those check-in points.
So Bill, how do you connect with the congregations if the pastors aren't willing? Or do you not deal with the pastors only? There's going to be a lot more congregations that won't have pastors.
Well, good question. And I would say, first of all, you can't do an end around pastors. Right. You just can't. But I visit a lot of circuits, and what I hear from pastors right now is a lot of pain and concern. I was with one, I won't name it, and it's like, we have 1,532 communicant members in our circuit. Now, why is that an important number? Because you lose your vote at a convention when you get to 1499. So they are 33 people away from losing their vote. Now, I think that was a lousy motivation to have a shared ministry conversation, but I left that conversation with those pastors, having them think about, I showed them that in their region, they serve 11 counties, that they have 9 viable congregations, and they have a mission field of 300,000 people. But if they only look at their own community, they have a very narrow scope of it, and if they look at doing it on their own, they don't have the resources to do it. And literally, that's like a conversation less than 10 days ago. I received a message on Monday saying, we'd like to investigate that more. So part of it is show pastors the big picture. And then the second thing is help pastors understand that this is something that adds a lot of capacity to their ministries. And I find that there's so much creativity in the gifts of God's people, and we ought to celebrate that, and we empower that, and use our pastors in wiser ways than being tech people, for example. I tell pastors, like, okay, during an emergency, during COVID, you had to figure out how to get online and run Facebook. If you're still running Facebook, you're like you're like a very expensive resource in terms of theological education and leadership development to be doing Facebook. There are other people that you can throw that to and begin to run it. In an emergency, yeah, it's all hands on deck. But once you start to manage a crisis, you got to say, who has the gifts to do that? And probably better than me. Other questions? So the part is, don't go end around pastors, but begin to engage lay leadership in those conversations as quickly as you can. But you got to do that through the pastoral office there, or it's not going to work. Vacancies are a great opportunity, actually. Our district, I work for the Missouri district, we use intentional interims just to help congregations walk through this process to think about ways that they can share ministry, not as a consolidation move, but as a mission move. So I developed a way to talk about this called 7 models of ministry, and the first one is called the Bookmobile. And so think of these as tools. They're not prescriptive. I can find examples of places where congregations do bookmobiles, but the idea is that you got this toolbox of 7 pieces. And the first 2 tools are kind of low-hanging fruit. They're pretty easy to do. Almost any congregation could do them with fairly little effort. And so the bookmobile is the idea. When I was a kid, my neighborhood in Chicago did not have a local library, and so they brought a little bookmobile around, and every Tuesday it parked in my church's parking lot, and I would go there and get books and return books there. And that was a way of getting the services into my community. Well, the bookmobile is a way for us to think about what are the kinds of ministries in our region or among our churches that are done fairly well and don't need to be reinvented in every congregation. They can be taken on the road, either through the same team of people that develop them or by resourcing and teaching others in other congregations to do them. So, for example, the most obvious example would be something like Vacation Bible School. Why do we have every church spend 9 months of the year planning Vacation Bible School? When a team of churches could get together, plan it out, figure out how to keep it on the road, resource it with volunteers, and put our energies into connecting with parents who are the real customers of Vacation Bible School.
Hey, Bill, so I've known Bill for a long time. So we have a fairly big Vacation Bible School, but over the years, what's happened is we do Vacation Bible School, and because of all the resources that are put in, those resources get passed on to different churches for their VBSs, and especially even the city church in Bethlehem or whatever. They've been doing this for years. And those things can get reused. That's good stewardship.
It's great stewardship.
So, and it kind of happened naturally. So
and not just of the money, the time and creative talent in those things.
It's been a blessing to see that just extend. And we didn't do anything except there's a lot of work to do in the first place.
But this could be like grief-based ministries, job counseling, and hardship. I found that in Chicago, I went through this, is that I found that in 2007, when all the bankers and financial people lost their jobs, they would not go to a support group in their church because it was just so painful. And so I got together with other churches in the area and said, let's create a network for these guys to be able to be in safe places, and they might have to be on different grounds than your church. And so, that was a different kind of bookmobile, and often some of the key people that knew how to help guys and gals in that field, we're able to transition over to train and develop leaders for those cohorts. So there's lots of different sort of programmatic ministries that a Bookmobile approach can take. Beware, and I've developed some assessment tools for this, is COVID did this incredible thing by shutting down every program in the church. And I think John would agree with me, my buddy, is that many pastors have grieved with me that they're slaves to their programs and they don't always make disciples. COVID did you this favor of shutting everything down, giving you a free pass at evaluating everything and saying, what do we celebrate and retire? What do we adapt into new ways? And what's a new path forward in terms of discipleship? And if some of that new path is in a shared relationship rather than reinventing the wheel, this is a great time to have that conversation. The second one, and then we'll pause for a check-in, is what I call the co-op. Now, I did this initially in a rural area, and so I learned all about co-ops. I didn't know anything about co-ops other than like REI. And so, but co-op is the lifeblood of business in the agricultural industry. And what had happened in the 80s during the farm crisis is that a lot of the ma-pa co-ops that served, 5-6 family farms could no longer operate. They just did not have the capacity to deal with global markets. And so co-ops began to buy up smaller co-ops, and so you had massive co-ops. And the interesting thing is my tiny town, one of the smallest towns in all of southwest Oklahoma, was the center of the co-op that owned everything. It was the big kahuna. And it owned everything, but it had huge market power to sell grain in Galveston. I learned that co-ops had to buy railroad cars to send it. And you bought a railroad car and you shipped it to Galveston and then you sold it to a broker in Galveston. Well, if a little ma-pa co-op had to buy 10 railroad cars, that was a very challenging business decision. But this co-op would buy 500 railroad cars and had immense capacity. So what does this look like for the church? Our 4 churches, the churches that we were serving, the other 3 didn't have office hours, period. And we just decided, well, we're going to link the phone systems and make sure that every church, 6 days a week, had phones answered. And that somebody was dispatching people. Now, this is the 90s, so we had modern technology of digital pagers. That was the best we could do. But we're scattered over, our staff is scattered over 4,500 square miles, and the dispatcher in our main office would say, so-and-so's at this place needs some help. You're 10 minutes away, can you get up there? And so just the idea of sort of office administration of keeping places open. The second thing we did is, why do we need 4 $10,000 copiers? And so we consolidated a whole printing and production operation. Today I would look at that from a tech point of view of website development, looking and evaluating at the kinds of things that you're video streaming and video resourcing to the public, etc. How do you co-op with that? Does a group of churches say, the high school kids are great, but they're not necessarily consistent, and they don't always reflect our brand. Do 5 congregations hire a tech person to develop an overall strategy? In urban areas in particular, this is a facilities management issue. I see dozens of congregations in urban areas where faithful men have served decades in taking care of the furnaces, and they know all the ins and outs of the quirks of their building, but younger generations do not have the time to put into those that these folks that are barely climbing stairs right now are doing, and they're grieving. They're like, Pastor Geist, what do? I don't know what to do. But what would it look like for a group of urban churches to say, we're going to hire somebody that does facilities assessment, presents to the trustees a kind of maintenance issues that need to be addressed, is following a preventative maintenance cycle, is is doing the bidding of contracts and insurance issues. If you're in an urban area, you know it's almost impossible to insure your church these days for property. That companies just don't want to cover you. And if they do, they'll give you enormous deductibles. I have churches that have $50,000, $100,000 deductibles on their property. What if you co-opt with, I see LCF here, what if you co-opt with a pool of high deductible risk pooling to think about catastrophic issues? So those are co-op ideas of how congregations can work together. Check-in point. Okay.
I was going to say, I wish I could see a map of where your churches were that you're referencing in Oklahoma.
Okay.
That's all right. Neither did
And I could have done that, but I didn't for this reason is, that was one place, but I for example, I see tons of urban applications, suburban applications to this. The next group of 3 is going to go from sort of low-hanging fruit, just things that I think any congregation can do, to looking at things in terms of relational systems. And so the first one is the most complex one, but I'm running into this all the time in what I call hub and spokes. I used to call this the circuit rider model. Because back in the 19th century and 20th century, you had pastors who were, on horseback running from church to church. Out in Springfield, Missouri, we have a circuit that has 19 churches. Almost every one of them was planted by Pastor Rader, who just went from place to place to place. Now, do you think Pastor Rader was there every Sunday? No, he wasn't. And Walther had 7 churches. Do you think he was preaching in every one every Sunday? He wasn't. They were raising up people that were taking care of those ministries that were left behind. And so when you think about hubs and spokes, the idea is just a slight modification of this, because you're going to have one or more places where you have word and sacrament ministry, okay? But they're gathering and sending, and you're going to be sending people. So for example, I'm sorry, I hit the wrong button. On the hubs, you're going to have word and sacrament, fellowship, and equipping of people. And when I use the word fellowship, I mean, like, for example, best practice is a giant hub of Lutherans once a year coming together and saying there's actually a lot of us. And that sense of community from a large group is powerful and effective, just as pilgrimage did that for Israel in the festival cycle, right? So connecting people to fellowship opportunities. Let's say you have churches of 8 and 10 people. In the Missouri district, we have 68 congregations that have 30 or less people in worship on a Sunday morning. But if they were able to go to a hub where there were 200 on occasion, that might be a word of encouragement to them, and it might be a place of fellowship. But it's also a place of equipping, because the gathering of the hubs isn't just for the sake of feel good and know you're forgiven. It's being equipped to be in mission and sent out. So the hubs are these sending out places, so that when we go to the spokes, that's where the mission really takes place. I mentioned that church of 8. That was in such a fertile community, and we're like, we can't lose this church of 8. We need to equip these people. We need to send resources there, because down on the spokes are all kinds of little communities where we want to connect people to Jesus. And we had identified 12 communities that we wanted to be connected to. Now, this is a background picture, is a portion of the Lake of the Ozarks. This is a ministry nightmare, because you have all these nooks and crannies of lake properties. Many of them are gated communities. Others are senior living communities with giant apartment complexes. How do you do ministry in a place like that? Because you can hang a sign out and hope people show up to your place. The LCMS has 4 congregations in various parts of this lake. And what I'm trying to convince those congregations to say is, those are the hubs. But you need to be able to send people to say, you live in that retirement community, you're the missionary to that retirement community, and we really don't want you here volunteering on Wednesday night. We want you to put all your volunteer resources the other 6 days of the week into your retirement community. And once a week you can gather with us. In other places like remote areas where we're doing a study right now of northeast Arkansas, the Boot Hill, Missouri, and lower Missouri. And tons of territory, hard to reach. And we're looking at maybe 4 hubs with micro churches around those hubs, where those micro churches might be meeting in homes and gatherings 3 or 4 times a month, but on occasions once a month or every couple of months they would get together at a hub church for a more substantial gathering, word and sacrament equipping, etc. And I think this is increasingly the future of the church, because John's in a really good sized church, but it's a planting church, and that's why it's effective. I do not see from research and reading and other things that super large churches are the long-term future of that, unless those super large churches break down into smaller, meaningful, relational units where people are discipled. And smaller churches have the opportunity to do that if they focus on that and not try to do all the other things. So when you're on the spokes, that's where all the critical ministry is doing, of making disciples and getting people into not only in the Word, but also in the sense of their personal mission and God's calling in their life. And when they see themselves as servants of God to that community and empowered to do so, that's life-changing to a community. So the spokes are really super highways of what I would call church multiplication, of how do you multiply the work of ministry among churches. That includes small churches, it includes small groups, house churches, and specific ministries like campus ministries. That's the spoke, right? And it's a spoke that has new spokes in it, because not only do you have a campus ministry to students, but we have a tendency to treat campus ministries like save our children so that they don't become Baptist. But what if campus ministry were envisioned of equipping our college students to say, through your vocation, you're going to be a missionary somewhere on this planet, and we want to help you be ready to be sent to the next place. The next relational model is what I call the family reunion. I've run into a number of churches that have like deep histories, and they're just 1 or 2 funerals away from being museums. And they're powerful histories. This is Pilot Knob, Missouri. This picture here. This church was commandeered during the Civil War Battle of Pilot Knob and became a hospital. You can still go into that church if Polly will let you in, and you can see the blood on the floor of the soldiers that were hospitalized there. And so it's a very sacred ground to this church. There are about 9 people left in it. Nearby Ironton has a church of about 60 members, and people are like, well, why don't they close Pilot Knob? Those 9 people can go 2 miles away to Ironton. Well, this has deep roots, and it draws people to their roots at certain summer occasions, holidays, etc. So we're talking to them about how do you leverage your history in such a way that when people come to you, we know they're not going to stay there, but what do you do with your history in such a way that it's an opportunity to connect people to the gospel and retool the connections you have with networks of other churches? So how this played out in a more practical way, because this is a pretty unique situation. When I was in Oklahoma, one of the things we did was a lot of people came home for the holidays at Christmas. So we decided that we would reshape the way we did Christmas worship and what we gave away in terms of like the bags with fruit and nuts and that kind of stuff. And we started to use the holiday celebration as a way to resource parents to help tell the Jesus stories to their kids. And so we retooled everything we did. We did tons of training leading up to Christmas to say, yeah, we're going to sing Silent Night, Enjoy the World, we're going to do all our traditions. But what's really important is all your grandkids are coming here for dinner, and they're also coming to worship Jesus, and we know most of them aren't in church. So how do we help you have a spiritual conversation and a connection to them that's meaningful? That's the family reunion.
Bill, you know what the average size of a church plant is today? This is insightful. Because we've been coaching calls, I've been listening, but the average size is 14 people. The average size church. So it's become very house churchish. But that's how they're starting new churches and new sites. And that was, what's the average LCMS church, do you know?
In Missouri, the median is 77. And it's probably, I don't, but I would imagine that Missouri tends to mirror the Synod in general. So 77 is our median size church in the Missouri district. That is, I only count worship attendance. And this is 2019 numbers, by the way. I just don't count COVID numbers.
I just think people have a perception that we have to have a lot more, or a lot, you know what I mean? To where it probably stops us from taking the lead to start.
I am, I probably didn't start out this way, but I learned very early on that small churches are probably the hope of the world, because we used to talk about being in a post-Christian society, but now we're in a pre-Christian society. There's no basis for understanding even who Jesus is other than media portrayals of him, which are highly distorted. And so to be able to walk with somebody and help them understand who this Jesus is, this is a Jesus ministry with 12 disciples walking from place to place, and you can't do that thousands at a time. You can't do that for mass media. You have to be able to train people to one-on-one disciple other people, because people don't know who Jesus is, and they're not going to get it from the internet. And so I think small churches are on the tip of the spear of all that. The problem is small churches can't afford, if you have a church of 14, you cannot afford to pay a pastor. Let's just be honest. You can't afford a building. And if you can, there's a problem with that, because you ought to be spending those resources on discipling other people rather than on the comfort of having your own pastor and building. So one of the challenges is, how do we reapportion our resources in such a way that pastors are equipping and serving in such a way that we're discipling more people. And that requires a lot of paradigm shifts for us, but God's kind of forced us into this picture as we face this new climate we're in. And again, COVID kind of knocked the wind out of church attendance, and so we have to rethink how we are developing relationships in terms of discipleship. It's not mass marketing, it's personal relationships. Finally, the one that moves things most effective, and John has been this kind of church shared ministry, is a mother-daughter relationship, where you have congregations that have more resources willing to share them with those who have less. Now, a couple of things about that. The number one problem, the number one go-to answer for shared ministry is usually like, you're small and I'm small, so can't we come together and combine resources? And two small churches do not make a resourced, effective church. And so it seems counterintuitive that a larger church that has a different kind of culture than a smaller church might not on the surface feel like that's a good fit. But if you spend enough time working through the relationships, you find that larger churches, first of all, are not interested in gobbling up small churches. You know, the small church is like, well, if St. John's by the gas station partners with us and does some youth ministry with our youth. All the youth will go to their church because that'll be the fun church. And we'll lose our kids completely. But what I find in working with larger churches and educating people is that larger churches just want ministry to happen, and they're more than willing to resource and support youth ministry on outlying areas. It's just like their small groups ministry. And so it provides our youth an opportunity to have more fellowship among other youth and connections, but at the same time connect to their own communities, school districts, etc. So you have to help each church involved in a mother-daughter relationship to appreciate and be confident in its own identity, and not be so fearful of the hostile takeover. But you just put that on the ground. So, okay, another check-in point. These are 3 relational models: the hub and spokes, the mother-daughter, and this kind of interesting, the occasional gathering of people who have connections probably to other networks of churches.
About for the spokes, how do you kind of implement those spokes in the sense of how do you build up lay leaders in those? So how do you actually get action?
Well, I mean, you really have to be intentional in a process of that. I feel that most churches will need a coach to do something like that, because there's a learning curve. Pastors are not really educated to develop that kind of thing, and they're going to have to work through a lot of issues. And the guy behind you, John, he's done a lot of work in discipleship, so he's written his own curriculum to do those kind of things. Some of the things that you have to keep in mind that oftentimes spoke kind of ministries function like either small groups or social ministries. But what I'd like to do is say, let's define a spoke by like an Acts 2 kind of community where people have fellowship with one another, in the Word together. They're praying for one another. They have a sense of service and purpose in their community, and they enjoy the favor of all people in their community. And when a group of people in a community or a household sees their neighborhood that way and says, okay, I want to have fellowship, I want to break bread with people. It's not just, well, I want to invite them to Bible study. Okay, that's part of it. Or, I want to be able to be able to pray for my neighbor, not just fix the kitchen sink for them. Now, but all of those things are important. In other words, I ought to be helping and serving my neighbor. My neighbor is, one neighbor's Muslim, one neighbor is 92 years old. So, like, I cut my 92-year-old lady grass, and I regularly and intentionally visit and have family conversations with 3 generations of Muslims who live next to me, and they introduced me to their tribe, so to speak, as my Christian friends, because they feel guilty that they can't find any Christians who want to be friends with them. And so, that's my neighborhood, those 2 households, and that's like my personal ministry is the 92-year-old lady and my 3-generation Muslim family who are like big leaders in their community. And so, you have to have that sense of saying, it's not just having Bible study with them, but it's not avoiding Bible study with them either. It's holistic. And I just think that probably needs education, some coaching, so that there's no one size fits all to make this work. And so a good coach will help you ask questions and check in and be accountable to that. The other thing is just in the spokes, just don't try to do everything all at once. Like when we identified 12 communities, we just started to say, well, a bunch of you live in this place called Blair, and there's no Lutheran church there, so what does it look like to develop relationships in Blair, and how are you going to serve? Today, one of the pastors there is the baseball coach just outside of Blair, and it's the place that if you want a kid to get to semi-pro ball in Southwest Oklahoma, you go to Navajo School, and he's the pastor and he's the baseball coach of the high school. So that strategy years and years ago has led to some significant work in that community. So the last two are what I would call leadership development tracks. Okay, and the first one is the whole idea of saying that like we did in Oklahoma, that the idea of saying, how do you develop a team of people that is not just about word and sacrament ministry? How do you build around the pastoral office those kinds of things, either in terms of professional staff or high-level volunteer that are actually accountable ministry leaders that holistically address specialties. I was doing so much casework for children and families in Oklahoma that I knew I was doing it the hard way, and I was not good at it and wasting time and slow at it. And having a social worker on my staff was just so critical to where we were in ministry. So that added so much capacity to us. And those people were that team was a regular part of our, we worked and functioned like a team. We had each other's back. It didn't just say, well, this is my job here. It's like if somebody was in the hospital and the social worker was the closest one, the social worker went, not the pastor. Or if it was the business manager went to the hospital. We worked as a team to do that. Sometimes the holistic team this is the hardest one, but sometimes you can do that with multiple pastors working together, but it really almost takes an intentional call process to call people into that ministry who are willing to work with one another and not sort of fight for turf or who's senior pastor and that kind of thing. So I'll show you what I think is the more excellent way in that kind of thing, and what I call the family business, and that is, thank God our church body has more roots to the educating of pastors, deaconesses, and other church workers than just residential education. And I think that we need to think more and more about how we develop leadership from within our communities for passing on the family business from generation to generation. Not many people want to live in Southwest Oklahoma unless you have lived there for 3 generations. And I was just, in this succession of pastors that had crashed and burned there. And, I was this exception to the rule by staying 15 years. And I could easily retire because it was just like, that's my home in many ways. My daughters moved back to Oklahoma after they're grown up and had children and all those kinds of things. But for the most part, it's hard to parachute somebody in from Chicago and make their life invested there. It just is. And so we said, people aren't begging to come here, so we're going to just develop the people that will serve this. And I'm pleased to say that they're on the second generation since me of pastors ordained to serve those ministries beyond my time there. They developed their own social worker. She was gifted in it. She was in school, and it's like, we'll help you get your master's degree. And then this wonderful thing happened is the county said, you're really good at this, and they hired her, so now she's paid by the county instead of the church. And so we said, this is the family business, and we're going to just build into our culture the idea of who's next, who are we raising up to do ministry in this place, and get ourselves educated on the pathways to develop church workers that align with our synod in such a way that we won't get in too much trouble, so to speak. But I think that's really important, is to whether you're in a urban setting. I just think sometimes urban areas are challenges as well, as trying to find outsiders come into urban areas. I'm a 7th generation Chicagoan. I can tell you about the power structure of Chicago. And a guy who comes from Florida to be a pastor in the city of Chicago doesn't know beans about how to work the networks and how the political system works in that windy city. It's a challenging place. So something about thinking about the church as family business, developing a pipeline of leadership all the way from your volunteers to your ministry professionals should be a part of your church culture. Check-in point. And pretty much, I'm trying to look at our time here, brings me through the 7 models that I use of saying, this is like a toolbox that you can take bits and pieces of and say, here's what might work for us. And so one of the things that we do is, in Missouri District, we develop a process we take congregations through. We remind them of this definition, because this is where we're working. And I've created a little library for you that has deeper explanation of this presentation on it. So this PowerPoint with speaker's notes is there. Again, this is really part of something I do with several hours with congregations. And so you can pull stuff down there. I had, just so you know, there's a paper on there called the draft. It just begins with draft. I can't remember what it was, but I had a writer redo some work I had, and I just got it last week, and I was kind of uncomfortable with all the, not so much the content of the material, just I wanted more resources in it. So we're going to have some upgrades to that site in the next few weeks. One of those upgrades is if you look in there, there's a little worksheet, a white paper called the co-op model, and it's just sort of a stronger exercise document. There are process documents in the works for all 7 models of saying how do you work through that in a way that we want to help congregations do some independent work and follow up with me through coaching. So we're trying to develop this resource library for that. And Missouri District doesn't care, and I don't care about sharing that with you and offering support, because I believe that when you look at the demographic shifts going on in our synod and in enrollment in our educational institutions, if we're not developing these models in our churches, we're going to create inefficiencies in the use of our church workers that will, I think, contribute to decline in our churches, but they also will contribute toward the frustration of our church workers. I feel that a healthy design shared ministry model is more likely to create a climate where the church worker is cared for, has accountability, grows stronger professionally in ministry. And so I just say never work alone, even if you're the sole pastor.
It seems to me like the overall overarching theme here is learning to be adaptive to different environments, rather than expecting people from the environment to adapt to the traditions that people have gotten used to. That's a significant mental shift. Are there any insights you have in how you coach whole congregations towards that kind of shift in thinking? I think it's a real watershed for a synod.
Well, the first is, and I heard Bill Woozy in the last presentation where I attended say this, and that is, never defame the past. I think that is just so important, because we're standing on someone else's shoulders. We are built on foundations that we didn't build for times that we didn't live in. And things that worked 100 years ago and don't work today weren't bad. They just don't work today. It has, and so one of the things is that I think we have to, first of all, help people to understand that change processes should never defame the past, even if there were sins in the past. My second group of churches, or shared ministry church and school that I had back-to-back alcoholic failure pastors. It was like a big part of its history, but at the same time, we didn't defame the past. We tried to build on those things that came out of that were positive. And one of the positive things that happened was there was initially a negative distrust of clergy, and so developed strong lay leadership and high responsibility for lay leaders in ministry. And so it's like, let's celebrate that. That's a good thing. And so that's important. The second thing is, I think I've done congregational surveys in over 40 congregations, and all but one had number one or number two, next generation ministries is the most important concern of their congregation. But closely associated to it was a subtext and a narrative of hundreds of readings of people writing comments, is they really didn't know how to do it. And I really empathize with that. And so I think part of that is to identify some of the things that are deeply held in your heart and be willing to say, we don't have all the answers, and pastors aren't the Hail Mary answer, but we can go find them. And I think we find that by doing more shared ministry activity. Congregation I just worked with, a fairly large congregation, said, we just don't know how to reach the next generation. And I said, well, why don't you commit to being a learning community that would just for the next 6 months visit every church, podcast, whatever you name it, to just find out what in the world people are doing out there, to see the landscape of the land, because we tend to be pretty insular. So I think you kind of create a culture out of the crisis that says there's an opportunity in this. We don't have to think fatalistically about that, but it does motivate us to people will face change when they're uncomfortable. It does take good leadership. And one of the things I would say about that is there are some studies by the Lilly Endowment that suggest that pastors are maybe above average in terms of vision leadership for congregations, but by and large, people who have vision and the ability to communicate that are a small portion of the population. That means that most of our pastors are probably not the visionary leaders in terms of fueling that. And if what I try to do in my personal walk with pastors is say, it's okay if you don't come up with it. But you probably do have to be the spokesperson for it. So, how but in your congregation or among your congregations, if you're small and you have groups of congregations, there are people that God has placed in your midst that have vision. And so how do you find that, collect that, gather that, and figure out how to develop the narrative to speak to that? Because people will follow a compelling vision, especially if you take small steps in experimenting with it and showing success. A good example we did in Oklahoma was that there was this crisis point of saying, well, we're probably not going to lose our church, but now we're afraid we're going to lose our public school. And if we lose our public school, there's no more town left. It's just a co-op. So I said, well, what do we want to do about that? And we sat down with superintendents of schools and learned the issues and talked to school board members. And we we said, we have 6 retired teachers from other school districts in our congregation. Is that an accident? And so we started to work with the public school and saying, how can these retired people help fill in gaps and deficiencies that you have? How can our church provide ways that after school we can begin to address issues like behavioral problems, learning disabilities, etc. And we started this after school program called the Jesus Club, which was like 7 kids initially. But once we got some really talented lay people involved in it, it grew to 70 within a year's time. And the school's like, we'll just put the church on the bus route because test scores, everything is changing because of that. So what I'm saying by that example is we saw a crisis that we weren't willing to lay down and die to. And we were willing to sacrifice anything to make it happen. And it was an all hands on deck. So it's like there were senior citizens who were, making meals for kids after school to have a good meal after school. We had read a study of kids that didn't have male role models in their life, had deficiencies later in life, and many of these came from single parent households. So I talked to the farmers and I said, you come and BS over coffee about 3 o'clock in the afternoon every day from the fields. I'll make the coffee. Would you listen to kids BS and pray for those kids and keep a little prayer journal? So every farmer in my church did that. He came in, got his coffee, sat down with 5 kids. They had a little prayer journal, and just the guy would just talk to a group of boys and girls and hear what's going on at home. They'd write it in the book and they'd pray, and that was it. And to this day, some of those men, I went to a funeral there 6 months ago. Some of those men had now adult children, come back and pay tribute to those mentoring relationships. That was a huge change in their behavior as men in our community. But they were willing to do it because it was all hands on deck. Any other questions, comments? I just encourage you to see it as an opportunity. And regardless of your size, whether you're 8 or 8,000, I think my personal opinion is that every church in Christendom ought to think of itself as how can I be a part of sharing for the sake of the kingdom of God. And I think we'll be better for it because there's just too much still innate competitive spirit among us that actually hurts us. And living in a pre-Christian culture now, we need each other to make it work. Thanks for coming.